Thank you for being here. I'm Rabbi Tobin, and I'm the rabbi here at Bnai Shalom in West Orange, New Jersey. The lecture this evening, or the hopefully conversation by the time we're done, is a simple but disturbing question. Is the conservative movement still a movement? Alternate titles that were suggested were things like, is conservative Judaism dead? This is not my opinion at this point, or I wouldn't be standing in front of you dedicating my life's work to the enterprise that's called conservative Judaism. However, there have been those in the public forum in recent weeks, including former leaders of the conservative movement, who have precisely declared that the conservative movement is dead or dying and has no future. So those are serious statements coming from intelligent people that I respect, and they base it in the facts most recently published by the Pew Foundation on a survey of American Jewish life. And we're going to spend a little time with that this evening, and we're going to look at that. We're going to ask ourselves questions like, what is a movement? What is a religious movement? What are the primary aspects or components of a religious movement? Does the conservative movement have that today? So we're going to do a little bit of history of the conservative movement, not too much. We're going to identify those elements, and then we're going to get into some of the Pew study and its implications for us. Okay? And at the end, there will definitely be room for questions. But if you've been here for my sermons before on Shabbat morning, you know I welcome questions even as they roll along. So if something comes up and you have a burning desire or an important correction, by all means, if you raise your hand, I will call on you, or I will ask your indulgence while I finish that thought, and I'll try and come back to you. Okay? You ready to start? In the back, as you came in, there were a number of photocopies of the overview section of the Pew study. We are not going to read through that. I encourage you to pick it up and to take it home and to go to their site, which is on the bottom of each page, pewresearch.org/religion, and look it up. They have also done surveys of other religions. One of the most important things to realize is that the tracking of our religion in many ways follows a pattern which has also shown up in their surveys of other religions. The more suburban you are, the more you look like the other suburban religions. So the Protestants and the Methodists and the Presbyterians are tracking in similar ways as the conservative Jews. So there is something bigger than us happening. We're not going to explore that broader context, but you do need to know that that context is probably one of the strongest influences over what we're going to be looking at. So we are going to proceed with first the question of what is a religious movement. To be a religious movement, you basically need a handful of things. You need to have common beliefs. There has to be something, and to be religious, something theological. Something that has to do with a relationship with God. Not just higher meaning, but a relationship with the concept of deity, of godliness or God as a being. That's essential to be religious. To be a religious movement, however, you also need a few things. You need to have either a central authority or a central vision which drives the proponents of that religious movement forward in a common direction. In that sentence that I just said are a few other elements that are necessary. You actually need to be a movement, which means you need to have a population. You can't just be somebody writing a book behind a curtain and claim that you're part of a religious movement. And we have a lot of that on the internet now. There's a lot of unique religious voices out there on the internet who don't really reflect or represent any significant number of people. By significant, I would say something that could join in a communal setting, a building like a synagogue or a church. The conservative movement was founded as a movement with a large population. Then, of course, the last thing I mentioned was common activity. I talked about that vision or that authority driving you forward in common activity. That's the movement part. In common activity towards those goals or those demands from that authority or that vision, all of which reflect the common beliefs that make you unique and different from other religious movements. So the final statement is you have to be unique. You can't claim to be a religious movement and then teach everything that the Catholic Church teaches. That doesn't make you a religious movement. That makes you a clone of another religious movement. So you need to be unique, you need to have common beliefs, you need to have central authority or compelling central vision, you need to have a population and common activity. So the conservative movement began over 100 years ago, and you need to understand that it was founded by a particular worldview. And my argument is that conservative Judaism, more than anything else, is a particular worldview and attitude about the world from a Jewish point of view, but a particular Jewish point of view. And it's that worldview that results in everything else that has ever happened under the banner of conservative Judaism. The worldview is that the ancient past is no more or less noble than the present, and that the Jewish relationship with God is expressed through Torah in the people of Israel, and in our day, although this was not the case when the movement was founded, in the land of Israel as a reality. They would have said in the land of Israel as an ideal. Because again, it's the late 1800s, early 1900s. So what does that mean? All Jews, more or less, except for the humanists in our day, would say that God, Torah, and Israel are the essence of Judaism. Everyone would agree on that. They interpret those things very differently. But God, Torah, and Israel together are a pretty good definition of Judaism. The conservative movement, however, was founded by a particular kind of intellectual person. Solomon Schechter was the great example of this, the founding father. He's the kind of guy who likes to dig through old cupboards, find manuscripts and books, and spend days and weeks and months poring through the details of them, and then saying, look what we found in this clay pot. Compare it to what's in that book that our people have been reading for the last 2,000 years. They're so similar. They're so different. And to take the rabbinic tradition of Mishnah and Talmud and combine it with those fragments that are being learned in the academic archaeological sphere, and to find out of that higher, greater, or deeper truths about what the sacred texts of our tradition meant, where they came from, and therefore what they can mean for us. That was a long run-on sentence. So I will back up on that, and I will now say what I really mean clearly. We learn from everything, but the core is still the core. That's conservative Judaism. We learn from everything, but the core is still the core. We can learn from archaeology, we can learn from science, we can learn from the Petri dish, we can learn from non-Jews, we can learn from critiques of our religion, we can learn from biblical criticism, we can learn from everything, and all of those things, if they are proven to be reasonable or true, can inform our religious understanding of God, Torah, and Israel. All of those things contribute, okay? But the core is the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and our history as a people that was, we believe, and they use this phrase, in a positive historic Judaism. We believe that there were real events that are reflected in the historical books of our Bible, that they were real people, those things actually happened to people we know. And historical books, let's leave the first chapters of Genesis off the table for now, because that's not a unifying opinion in the conservative movement today, whether that was real in the same sense that Hezekiah was real. Truth, yes, but that's another class, another day. What we do agree on as the conservative movement is there's positive historical Judaism. There were people who lived. I believe there was a Moses. I believe there were children of Israel in Egypt. I believe in Mount Sinai. I believe that we went into the land of Israel and that we conquered it, and that a lot of good there and a lot of bad there happened. I believe that there were these foreign conquerors. I believe that there was exile. I believe there was return. I believe there was ultimately another exile. Do I believe 8 days of Hanukkah? I believe 8 days of Hanukkah. Do I believe a cruse of oil that was written about 5 centuries later in the Talmud? I don't know. Why not? This week I believe it. And I love it. But most importantly, I value it, I keep it, and I observe it, and I recognize that it is a core belief of our people and a part of our relationship with God, Torah, and Israel. That's not changing. If someone showed me that the cruise lasted 9 days, I'm unlikely to add a 9th. If they showed it burned out in 1, I would be unlikely to go back to 1. Because how our people have lived this history has a compelling authoritative impact on us, as well as what is written in the books. Okay, so that's where we come from. These guys were academics. They were college professors. They were researchers. They were scientifically minded people. They were the founders of conservative Judaism. And they found themselves in a new world, a world that was theoretically open. And they wanted a Judaism that fit America. So conservative Judaism, this attitude that truth comes from multiple places and all of it comes to us as a gift from God to inform our understanding of an unchanging core that we really do believe in, this attitude is what allows us to go into the historical background of our people at different times and places and to say, wow, it was really different here, and it was really different there, it was really different there. And there were 7 kinds of Jews in that city in that century. And that's cool, and we like that, as opposed to needing everything to kind of be homogeneous and the same at all times and places. We like discovering in the conservative movement differences, pluralisms, varieties of Judaism, competing and contrasting halakhic authorities, people who disagreed with each other. Not just Sephardi and Ashkenazi, but within Ashkenazi. We like finding that variety because we see it in our life. We see it around us. Let me give you an analogy, and then we'll move on to details in our current day. The analogy is this. Let's say you want to brew beer. And you have a recipe for beer. It's a relatively simple recipe. It comes down from thousands of years ago. To brew beer, you need water, and you need grain, and you need yeast, and you need sugar, and you need hops, if you like bitter flavor. That's about it. That's the recipe. But if you grow the grain in the land of Israel, or the hops comes from a mountainside, it's going to have a particular aspect and flavor to it. The recipe is the same. It's going to come out looking one way, smelling one way, tasting one way. You do that same recipe with the stuff that's growing in Kansas, and it's going to come out different. But it's the same recipe and the same materials and the same loyalty to that thing, but it's going to look and smell and taste different. But it's still beer, and you're not changing the recipe. That's what conservative Judaism was supposed to be. That's how it got founded. It's just that in every place, the ingredients are natively grown, and they combine with the eternal Torah, and so it comes up out of the ground looking like a slightly different Judaism. And not only is that an explanation of what happened, it's actually God's purpose, God's plan. It is how God does this. It's what God wants. God rejoices in it. Which means us living here in the suburbs of New Jersey is part of that. And how we get to be the way we are when we combine this lived life with Torah is also part of that same Judaism of King David. Not higher, not lower. The same Judaism of King David, despite all the many changes in the historical development that's happened over time. There's not an idyllic past that we're hoping to get back to, and there's not an assertion that the modern mythos of advancement is the morality of the modern age is better than the inferior, animal sacrifice of the ancient primitive world. We don't look at anything that way. We don't look at anything. We're in between. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. It moves like a sine curve, and history is history, and we're always this close to God. How close to God? This close to God. As close as the Torah, as close as the Jewish people, as close as the Lamb. Okay, so that's conservative Judaism. That's the attitude. That's the view. But I said you need to have a central authority and a central vision. So the central authority when we were founded was the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which, as you know, is a university. And it's not really a movement of congregations. It was a training place for rabbis in America to be trained to go out and serve the communities that existed. The communities that existed looked a lot like you would call Orthodox. Many of them had mechitzas. Right? They prayed from a very traditional prayer book that was all in Hebrew. If there was any translation, it would have been in Yiddish. The sermon was in Yiddish. It was an immigrant religion in many ways. And this new training ground was trying to train English-speaking rabbis who were masters of the tradition to match American assimilationist Jews. And that was the drive, to be assimilationist Jews who were yet different from the rest of the world, to look and succeed like the rest of the American citizenry, but to be different. And they were tremendously successful. And in the 1920s, they founded the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, which is the real center organizationally of conservative Judaism. It's the first and only organization with the word conservative in it. That was it. So a number of congregations, a couple of dozen, got together and formed this organization whose purpose was to conserve the traditions of American Judaism and to create them. And these new rabbis coming out of JTS, often in the bylaws and the contracts, you had to hire a JTS rabbi, or you couldn't be a member of the Union of Conservative Synagogues. That's still in this congregation's bylaws today. And in many, many conservative congregations, you cannot hire someone who didn't come from JTS, or now that there's more than one seminary, the conservative seminaries. Well, where did those congregations come from? And didn't they have rabbis before? So they did have rabbis. And what happened is boards of trustees voted to become conservative, often over the objections of their dear rabbi, who may have been not a conservative rabbi, and there are tales and stories straight through the 30s, 40s, and 50s of hundreds of congregations becoming conservative, the rabbi opposing it, and them having to get rid of, or the rabbi resign, and then hire a new rabbi from the conservative movement. That is really where over half of the 900 plus congregations of the 1960s came from. They started as non-conservative congregations that became conservative, which is why the Orthodox put in the excommunication rules and don't walk into their synagogues and don't work for them and don't sit down with them on Batei Din, and all that comes from the fact that we were an enormous threat against Orthodoxy. We were stealing synagogues left and right, and we were giggling all the way to the bank. And it wasn't a very kavodnik way to go about it because they believed, the movement believed it was a movement. It had a compelling common vision. And then people were moving in lockstep forward, and they were getting rid of the mechitzas, and people were sitting together, and they had prayer books which were in English and Hebrew with flowery translations, and rabbis who wore Western suits and spoke perfect English in their sermons. And this was compelling. And that was the movement. It was a movement. All right, so where did it go? It went into the 1960s, and the baby boomers' kids went to college, because all assimilationist Jews see success through college, which is absolutely correct. And then they wanted them still to be religious. But you put a lot more effort into sending your kids to college than into making them religious. So there was religious school on the one side, which started at 5 days and went down to 4 days and went down to 3 days. And by the time you got out of the 1970s and the 1980s, people were clamoring for 2 days, which they got in most of the synagogues. And people became very successful as people, not as Jews, in those public settings. And conservative Judaism actually took over the Jewish world in the 1970s in most of the communal boards, federations, JCCs, JEAs, boards of Jewish education, all kinds of places. Conservative Jews were the dominant membership of the boards of trustees of all these central institutions. People raised with this attitude towards Judaism, which is the conservative Jewish attitude, and not necessarily living the life of their grandparents in the home or in the holidays, right? But they took over the Jewish world. So that really got organized according to the often less observant side of conservative attitude, right? But in the meantime, we needed a cause. You need a cause to be a movement. So what was the cause of conservative Judaism in the 1970s? Throw that one out there for you. What was that? Egalitarianism. As soon as this became the big issue, the equality of women, that became a big issue. That became the defining issue for this movement for almost 20 years. It was the issue, that egalitarianism, and that women should be equal. And it started with the bat mitzvah, and then it went to aliyot to the Torah for women. Then it went to female officers speaking from the bima, right? And it went in these directions. And what that tells you is that the congregations changed that. The congregations developed egalitarianism. The Jewish Theological Seminary did not. So the intellectual elite and the movement's central authority in that area of being able to speak for what is permissible and not permissible was actually not the organization that implemented that massive change. That massive change happened in the seats of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. Boards of trustees voted to allow women to vote, voted to allow women to count. If you go to Chizuk Emunah congregation in Baltimore, they have a museum of their own history. And as you walk in, one of the primary things is a ballot that was sent to the congregation to vote, should women count in minyan? Yes, no. And they had voted yes. But that's not the classical form of change. But that's what the conservative movement became in many ways, adopting the folk needs and finding a halachic way to make that happen, as opposed to top-down, this is the halacha, we expect you to do it because it's what God wants. So what happened is that the authority of the conservative movement, the authority of Judaism, got turned on its head in the late 60s and early 70s, and decision-making changed. Now, that was not unique to conservative Judaism. That was America on the college campuses of the 1960s. Fraternal organizations plummeted in membership. Anything that reeked of ritual and classic tradition or snobbery or elitism, all of this kind of ritual life was really got knocked down on college campuses across the country, and that generation really just didn't buy into those trappings of their parents' lives. And classical religion, us, was one of the things that got broken down during that time period. So then what happened? We needed causes because this was such a rallying thing, egalitarianism, wow, that's great. And as we moved out of the 70s into the 80s, then it became not egalitarianism in the seats, it became egalitarian rabbinical school. And the struggle of letting women into the seminary or not into the seminary. Danny Gordis recently wrote that the death knell of conservative Judaism was driving on Shabbat. Personally, since that was a half a century ago and nobody cared and the synagogues were full after that, I don't see that. I think that what happened is we turned authority around, decision-making changed, and what happened is the Rabbinical Assembly, my union, the organization of rabbis, conservative rabbis in the world, has a committee on Jewish law and standards, but it began to function as something other than that. And it still functions as something other than that today. And they'll be very upset with me when they see this on YouTube. But the truth of the matter is you can't be an authority and say 3 conflicting opinions are all valid. You can be a pluralism, you can be a centrist movement, you can be a lot of things, but you've forfeited the right to be an authority when you say it can be this, that, or the other, and the things are in conflict with each other. And that's what happened a little bit with egalitarianism for women, and that's absolutely what happened with egalitarianism for homosexuality in the last decade, is that absolutely conflicting things were passed under the process, and then how do you make a decision as a congregation? The rabbis were flung out there to dry. You've got to fight it out with your board of trustees, individually, on issues of enormous import in society and halakha. Right? So I'm not saying that's good or bad. What I am saying is that's a breakdown of one of the 4 things we said a movement needs. A movement needs a central authority or vision. And egalitarianism is not a vision of Judaism. It's an expression of it. So when you spend 15, 20 years fighting that, and you're not talking about what the book of Exodus means, or, who were the rabbis of the Talmud and the Mishnah, or studying Talmud and Mishnah, as Jews did for centuries. Instead, we're fighting these other battles. It's terribly distracting. And it really did pull us away from many of the core issues. Now, in some areas, it lifted us up. Granted, it's not a bad thing, but I'm kind of analyzing this structurally. As a movement, that was the process that broke down authority for us. And we haven't gone back to it. We haven't gone back to it, and we don't have compelling issues now. At the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism Convention in Baltimore, just a few weeks ago, the vision put in front of the room was focus on social justice and exciting things and re-innovating prayer and all these kinds of things that will get people doing things other than classical Judaism, but doing them together underneath the flag of your synagogue, and then you'll have a dynamic community and you will survive. Well, that's very interesting, but that was critiqued in many editorial pages as that's really not the classical agenda, that's just the liberal social agenda of America, which you may or may not agree with. According to the Pew study, 67% of conservative Jews agree with that agenda. So that's fine, might be popular, but it's not exactly pulling out God, Torah, and Israel again, in that sense. All right, so now let's look at a couple of things that are really important to understand. Now that we put all that out there, does the movement have the things that we've said? Conservative Judaism has created several small organizations. Camp Ramah. Camp Ramah is under the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Because it is an educational setting. It is not a social setting. The United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism has the Women's League or the Federation of Men's Club, United Synagogue Youth, the social arms of the movement. The educational arms were supposed to be under JTS, except for United Synagogue also founded the Schechter movement. And the Schechter movement of day schools was founded by congregations because JTS didn't want to get into that business because they have their own school. And they're not on the ground around the country, so it didn't make sense. So USCJ also founded Schechter. So the 2 other organizations that come out of these are the Schechter School Movement and the Ramah Movement. Ramah is fabulously successful. Tremendous impact. Doing really well. Enrollments in Schechter are plummeting across the country as unaffiliated schools or as, what do they call them, charter schools are being created around Hebrew language and so forth. And the economics of the private school education are making it very difficult for Schechter schools to be sustainable. The Schechter school system here in West Orange is doing a great job about staying sustainable and trying to create new markets, but it's also seeing very significant decrease in enrollment over the last 10 years. That's just a fact. So we're seeing the population side of conservative Judaism shrink. The Pew study, let's get into some things. Oh, I'm sorry, the things that we have. So today, do we have central beliefs as conservative Jews to be a movement? I would argue yes. What a conservative Jew sees in the Torah is not what a Reformed Jew sees in the Torah, and it's not what an Orthodox Jew sees in the Torah. They are qualitatively different. The conservative Jew does read Torah in a way that's different on an average basis from the way an average Orthodox Jew reads or an average Reformed Jew reads. Very different, and it has that same worldview that I talked about before. I'm not arguing for superiority, so please don't see me saying that. What I'm saying is that it is unique and different and therefore worthy of being a movement. Because if it were not unique and different, it's a waste of everybody's time and money. Go to the other places, you can get it there. So I think we do read it in a very different way. We have central beliefs about God, Torah, and Israel, and the changing but still authoritative nature of halakha. I think those things are still relevant for us, even at a time when most of conservative Judaism nationwide is not observing those tenets. They still respect them and want them in place, even when they're not living them. Do we have a central authority or a vision? No, we do not. I'm sorry to say. I stand here in the pulpit and I give what I hope are compelling and authoritative messages and vision all the time. But I am functioning in parallel with other rabbis around the country. I am not functioning in a united manner with other rabbis around the country. And the boards of trustees are functioning according to their own needs and what this congregation needs, and are not functioning together with the other boards of trustees. If you think I'm kidding, when was the last time that there was a joint meeting of the conservative congregations of Essex County? When was the last time there was a joint program of the conservative congregations of Essex County? Anything. Nothing. So we're working in parallel. We're not working in lockstep. We may be doing the same things and going in the same direction, but we're doing it all on our own. So that's very difficult if you want to be a movement. Do we have a population? We still do have a population, but it is absolutely in decline. Around here, we're holding our own. We're pretty good. The Jewish population, according to the Metro West recent study, is going down 3% per year in this region. So any synagogue that's going down 3% per year in this region is just tracking the demographics and doing fine. If you're holding your own, you're holding your own. If you're growing, you didn't show up in any of the surveys that were done. The person who presented that survey said, there's one thing I need to tell every synagogue in this area, and that is build nothing. Look to your core, keep your building in great shape, do what you do well. There's no reason to think you're going to go out of business, but now is not the time for capital campaigns. That's what he said. For every synagogue and every movement. That's where we are. Do we have a population? Yes. But the problem is the population, according to the Pew study, is not only smaller. We used to be in the 40% of American Judaism, and now we are much lower, and we'll see the exact number in a little bit. But what's worse is only 11% of the Jews under the age of 30 identify as conservative Jews. That's a problem. In 10%, if it's 11% under 40, in 20 years, if it's 11% under 50, in 30 years, if it's 11% under 60, you see what it does. So there's got to be something that reverses the trend, captures or battens down the hatches and secures our means with current financial means and not future membership dollars, something. Do we have common activity? Do we have a common activity that we as a movement across the country are all doing? Yes. We just don't talk to each other about it. If you read the bulletins of conservative synagogues across the country, they're almost all the same. We're all doing the same stuff. We're writing the same articles, we're going to the same conventions, we're watching the same movies, we're reading the same books, we're doing the same activities, we're doing the same thing. With variations, instruments on Shabbat, no instruments on Shabbat. There's some significant variations, but we're doing the same thing. We're just doing it in parallel, not doing it like an organized movement. What about affiliation? Affiliation is a big problem. Affiliation is in decline. What I mean by affiliation is writing a check to an organization that says, thank you, you are now a member of this organization. Members do it by joining synagogues. That's in decline nationwide. And synagogues do it by joining the United Synagogue. That's in decline nationwide. We kind of got hit by a triple whammy. People started getting married later. People getting married in their 40s. They used to get married in their 30s. They used to get married in their 20s. When people got married in their 20s, their kids were grown by the time they were 45. And then they went off and they really worked and became the masters of industry, and they had money that they didn't need to spend on kids, and they got involved in their social organizations, and they gave that money to the synagogue. And you had 21-year-olds joining synagogues as new families who paid dues until they were 75. And for 55 years, that dues check came in from that one person year after year after year after year. And when they were 45, they started giving to the annual fund. And when they were 55, they endowed something in Bobby Sadie's memory. Right? That doesn't happen anymore. Because they're getting married at 40, 42, they're having a kid at 45. By the time they're 55, 60, and 65, they're still saving for college. And that ability to support the congregation simply doesn't exist as a matter of time or anything else. So the demographics of marriage have really messed with synagogue life as far as needing membership dues to keep us going. That's hard. Second thing, there was an economic downturn. That economic downturn killed us. Because synagogues are luxury items. Synagogues are paid out of discretionary income. It's after you pay your taxes and the doctor that you pay the synagogue. So when things got really tight, synagogues got hurt. And when synagogues got hurt because they have declining affiliation and declining enrollment and declining annual funds because people are getting married later and declining volunteer hours because everybody's got a little pisher kid at home even though they're 50 years old and when they throw the ball it hurts their arm for a week. Right? They're paying attention to their kids. They don't have time for the shul. Right? So what happens in that environment? The shul has to clamp down and get austere. So what are the things that go when the shul becomes austere? Staff. Kiddush. The things that bring people in. Right? Those things start to dwindle. Lower staff means lower services, means less personal touch, means less engagement, which becomes a cycle. The other thing that happened is as people became more kind of less authoritarian and more access to the service and these things, people wanted accessible services. They didn't really want the big show, and the cantor field came under attack. And rabbis and cantors didn't play well together. Rabbis and cantors have conflicts all across this great country. It's horrible. It's sad. It's pathetic. It's ridiculous. These are good people who want to serve the Jewish people together. Figure it out. Be adults. Right? And I say that as someone who has had 3 cantors and 2 great cantor relationships. And I was fully culpable for my 50% in the one that didn't go well. Absolutely. But it can work. The problem is when you have a budget and you can't pay both, who's going to go? The cantor. This shul has that too. The cantor salary has been going out of the budget forever. Getting a full cantor salary back, highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. So services go down. So do we have coherent clergy? We have coherent clergy, rabbis around the country who are more or less saying the same things. We have a good prayer book that does unite us, but that's about it. And the identity question when people say, are you a conservative Jew, is in decline. So what are we going to do? Let's look at the numbers. I do believe that the Pew study, despite knocking us down to 22% of the Jews in America, most of whom are over 50, I do believe that there's a recipe for the conservative movement to be a movement. I believe that we are a movement, but we are leaderless and rudderless, acting as individuals. And that's not something that a movement can do. I believe that there is a recipe for us to focus to be uniquely advantageous in the marketplace of Judaism right now. There are a few myths we need to bust as we do this. Okay, so in the Pew study, surprisingly, the majority of Orthodox and conservative kids are no longer of the Jewish affiliation their parents raised them to be. Let me say that again. You raise your kids. Whatever the Judaism of your home is, you raise them to be that Judaism. Right now, if they were raised to be Orthodox, 52% of those who were raised to be Orthodox no longer identify as Orthodox. That's a stunning number because the myth out there is Orthodoxy is booming and they are loyal and they're each having 500 kids and all those kids stay Orthodox and they're going to take over the world. The truth of the matter is the Pew study shows that Orthodoxy is losing a little more than half of their kids to non-Orthodoxy or non-Judaism as adults. Yes, sir?
Rabbi, I hate to correct you, but I think that's true of the total Orthodox population.
Yeah.
But if you do age cohorts, it's not true. Close to 20%.
Okay.
The young age cohorts are actually at a higher level than older age cohorts.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Thank you. I don't think it's a correction. I think it's an added detail.
Well, what it refers to is that people like my parents' generation, who may have grown up Orthodox, many of them are no longer Orthodox.
That's correct.
Most of the people who grow up Orthodox today, a very high percent of them are staying Orthodox.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. But a significant percentage of them are not. 20% is significant. 20% is significant. So that's still beyond what most people's stereotypical expectation would be. So let me just back up, because we're taking big picture here and sweeping changes in history, and I like that 52% number because it's actually measurably real, and it does go across ages. And that's all I'm describing right now, is what's the reality on the ground today, because I want to draw from it as far as how our imagination should drive us forward. As conservative Jews, the situation is worse. 64% of those raised in conservative households do not any longer identify as conservative Jews today. 64%. That means 1/3, a little more than 1/3 of those raised as conservative Jews and alive today as adults are still conservative Jews. That's where the loss is happening. Because Judaism in the last 50 years in America has actually grown 15%. The population of America has grown something like 50%, so we are a smaller percentage of America than we used to be, but there are more Jews than there used to be. So all of the movements should have gotten bigger because there's more Jews. Conservative Judaism did not get bigger. Conservative Judaism got smaller in numbers and a lot smaller in percentage. The Reform, however, keep their kids. And over 50% of Reform Jews identify as Reform when they grow up. So, what lesson do I learn from that? What I learned from that is, historically, which is what Robert is showing us, and also currently, we are much more likely to receive imports from Orthodoxy than we are to receive imports from Reform. Reform kids grow up and stay Reform in larger numbers, right, as far as they're shifting out. Now, the young Orthodox in certain communities of Orthodox, it's much more like 90% and beyond. It's again the Hasidic world, and this even shows strong modern Orthodox. But the truth of the matter is there's a significant number of people who leave Orthodoxy and who become conservative or are open to it. The other myth is that conservative Jews who become serious become Orthodox. But only 4% of the Jews surveyed who are Orthodox today were raised conservative. Or 4% of the conservative Jews who aren't conservative anymore are now Orthodox. That's it. Sorry, I misspoke. 4% of those raised conservative are now Orthodox. Okay? Now, is that anecdotally important? It's anecdotally important because I know those people. Those are the ones I met at Ramah. Those are the ones I went to at the seminary. They were all serious or they wouldn't have gotten there. So there's a brain drain there, but in the big demographic picture, not so much as we have been led to believe. Okay? Number 2. This sets us apart from Reform. And I'm going to focus a little on setting us apart from Reform because Orthodoxy is its own unique thing, and we're never going to join with Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is never going to open their arms and bring in conservative Judaism and say, welcome home, Brother Joseph. It's not going to happen. So let's look at Reform and conservative for a little bit. What sets us apart from Reform, which is really where we're competing in this larger marketplace? Surprisingly, one of the most important things that sets us apart from Reform is the idea that Judaism is a religion. The Pew study shows that over 40% of conservative Jews, their primary concept is that Judaism is a religion, whereas for the Reform, it's closer to like 20%. It's an identity, it's a culture, it's a heritage. Judaism is a religion. It's a compelling idea for conservative Jews or Jews who will be conservative. It's a very important piece of the pie. So we are not out there just for social grouping, although that's important to us. Our Jews are actually interested in God, Torah, and Israel. They're interested in the religion of Judaism. This is one of the primary differences. In the Reform movement, only 16% say that's a primary importance to them. Belief in God tracks similarly. Only 18% of all Jews identify as conservative, but 22% of those who identify Judaism as a religion are conservative. Does that make sense? So if you just take out the people who say Judaism is a religion, 22% of those are conservative. Numbers are higher. We do better among that attitude towards Judaism. Which means if we're looking to position ourselves as far as what we believe anyways and we want to say more, that would be something that we believe anyways, we want to say more. We want to be that. We want to be religious Judaism, in addition to culture and heritage. Number 3, Halacha and kashrut are on the most important list for only 19 and 14% of the American Jews respectively. In other words, most of the Jews that we're looking at are not so interested in halacha and kashrut as their most important way of being Jewish. That's difficult for a conservative Jew, very difficult for a conservative rabbi, because we believe that those are core. Those are core matters. They should not change. But the good news is those same people respect that religion and don't seem to be offended by the idea that Judaism is a religion and has those things in it. It just may not be for them. So the conservative Jew tends to be very supportive of high standard in the synagogue, even if it's out of touch with their own life. And the nice thing there is that you don't need to dumb down the kitchen in the conservative synagogue to the level of everyone's observance because you want to be like the people to make them comfortable. They're comfortable knowing that it's a very high standard of kashrut. They're comfortable with that. Of course, the conservative movement is religion, and that includes kashrut, even for the people who don't keep kosher. For example, 1/3 of our people keep kosher and light Shabbat candles nationwide. In this area, the numbers are higher. By the way, I want to take the Pew Study questions, and I want to send it just to the Bnai Shalom membership and see how the numbers track. That would be very fun. 1/3 keep kosher and light Shabbat candles. 3/4 fast on Yom Kippur. 80% attend a Seder. Now, there's a lot of room for improvement with those numbers, but it doesn't make halacha a sexy selling point for marketing. So if you want to be a successful conservative congregation, you need to be a place that people who are leaving Orthodoxy might be comfortable. You need to be a place that says Judaism is a religion as well as a culture, and you'll draw from the Reform folks who are more seriously minded about the religion aspects. You start to see how you can position yourself as a centrist organization with the things that we already believe, right? You don't want to move so far left that the person wanting to leave Orthodoxy doesn't feel like they can eat here. And you don't want to move so far left that the Reform person says, oh, you have social justice too. Why would I leave? Right? Why would I move? So for the questers, we want to be different and positioned in the middle because that's where we really belong anyways. Halacha and kashrut are important, but they're not selling points. Now, number 4. Everyone has the following top answers. All Jews believe that a core and essential part of Judaism is the Holocaust, social justice, morality, and personal ethics. Holocaust was top of the list. One of the most important things that people need to know about and have a relationship with and understand to be a Jew today. Holocaust, social justice, morality, and personal ethics. It's coming, but it's lower. These are the numbers that are over 60%. Over 60% of respondents said these are the top issues. So everybody agrees with those. So do I. Mazel tov. Move on. We should do those things, have those things, recognize those things, know those things. We all agree on those things. That's common Judaism. That's not the conservative movement. It's part of being Jewish, but conservative movement are the things that are unique that only we can do well. We can all do those things well. Those are the things that we should do with all the other synagogues in Essex County. Those are the things that everybody should be doing together. Holocaust, social justice, morality, and personal ethics. We all agree on that stuff. We should all agree on that stuff. That's ripe for communal programming. Okay? Not so much just for us. So what are the things that drop down below that where our respondents tick higher than other places? This was a major focus of the United Synagogue. And I'm sorry, let me move on, sorry. 49% believe that intellectual curiosity is an essential component to being Jewish. 49% intellectual curiosity and 43% caring about Israel as an essential component to Jewish identity. This is a national study. So if you drop down out of the things that everybody agrees on, a couple of these next ones are intellectual curiosity. Hey, that's us. And caring about Israel. We've done that from the beginning. So we've got a couple of things here that we can do in a unique manner that actually are in the top of other people's ideas of core Judaism, important things, and our people tick higher in areas of interest than the other movements in some of those areas, particularly against reform. So, if we must be relevant, we should push and challenge in those two areas. Challenge the intellectual curiosity of our members and the Israel programming of our synagogue. The numbers of the Pew Study show that that should be areas of fertile experimentation, uniquely suited to this congregation and conservative congregations nationwide. We have an advantage in competition with a combination in those areas. Synagogue attendance also, my fifth point, matters for conservative Jews. We know synagogue attendance matters for Orthodox Jews. It defines orthodoxy in many ways. Although interestingly, in the Hasidic community, attendance plummets. A lot of people staying home, right? Or in their smaller groups, not in the synagogue in the same way. Modern Orthodoxy is the highest. 81% of Orthodox attend synagogue once a month. 17% of Reform. 39% of conservative. Nationwide, 39% of conservative Jews say that they're going to synagogue once a month. That ain't so bad. We've got a higher percentage here, and it's more than once a month. Right? So this is a much more engaged synagogue in that area, but nationwide the conservative movement needs to realize that it's not engagement in the outside the synagogue activities that people keep talking about that is necessarily the fertile ground where we will compete well. Reform is killing us in those areas. We can engage our people in and through the synagogue because these core areas are actually places where the people interested in us tick with much higher interest levels, right? And we already have some success to build upon. Our synagogue services are therefore still our primary point of engagement with our congregation, unlike the more progressive movements. If you really want your congregation to deal with something, you deal with it in the synagogue on Shabbat, in synagogue on the holidays. That is the vehicle by which we should best engage our members. Now, not all our members, because we got another 30% who just come on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but that's okay. You get them in other ways. So what's the conclusions? And then I'll take all the questions we can fit. We are a movement. The conservative movement is absolutely still a movement. We have common beliefs, we have common practices, we have a shared vision. But we are rudderless in the wind right now. We have no leader. We have forfeited rabbinic authority within the movement as a whole. And each board and each rabbi is just dancing a dance trying to stay afloat. And trying to figure out what is the thing that we're going to do to pack the room again. Well, the demographics say you're not going to pack the room again. There's not enough Jews out there interested in conservative Judaism to consider packing the room. And if you're in an area of slow demographic decline, high taxes, and the school district next door is sexier, you're going to have a hard time packing the room. What we can do is you can lock down what you've got with a core message, because we seem like we should attract people who are serious, who see religion as an essential component of Judaism, who want to be intellectually challenged and curious, and want to have a relationship with Israel. Those things are fertile ground shown in the Pew study. Those are things that we can do. Now, if we're going to be part of a movement, we would hope that our movement is doing that. But it's not. If we want to be part of a movement, we could hope that they would lead or follow our lead. Maybe that's the mouse that roared. We're just a little shul. But if we set that example and show that it works, I think we can have a conversation with our neighbors, with the other conservative shuls in town. We're all facing the same stuff. Why can't it be more cooperative? Especially in some of those top areas that everyone agrees that aren't really threatening. So, we can focus on 5 areas. Conservative former Orthodox Jews. Learn from that experience what's involved. People who consider religion important are really our best market. And 10 to 15 percentage points higher response from women than men on that topic. 10% more women find religion to be an essential component to Jewish identity than men. The men weren't so interested in the religion in the study compared to the women, which means your ideal candidate is an intellectually curious, female, former Orthodox Jew who wants to be intellectually challenged and has 20 kids. That's your ideal candidate for the conservative synagogues of America. Because good things come from that. Oh, it's independently wealthy. We also want people who want a strong relationship with Israel, because we seem to have that communal road as fertile ground, according to the study. And we also want those who will respect Shabbat, Kashrut, and Halacha, even though they observe these things themselves in smaller numbers than their earlier generations. That's kind of the picture of the activities and the people who will find a compelling message in conservative Judaism as the years move forward. You get too far off of those ideas, you better be really flashy and really good at what you're doing, because the studies don't indicate that that's an area of current success for our movement. And what we're looking for is sustainability and engagement. I believe that there will always be a market for halachic, moderate, socially assimilated, secularly educated American conservative Jews who are neither Reform nor Orthodox, not by default and not by marriage, but by belief, that they have beliefs that match the beliefs of the conservative movement uniquely. I believe that there's a feeder population for this centrist position. The greatest feeder is our own kids, and that 1/3 number is horrific. We need to increase it through engagement with our kids and engagement with young adults as they grow. We do believe things in the conservative movement. We believe in one God. We believe in the God of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. And sure, in an intellectual adult ed setting, we'll talk about Bilhah and Zilpah. Why not? Because it's intellectually curious for us. What was that? Maybe there's something to learn there. We believe in a Torah that applies in every age in unique and powerful ways that are binding, but sometimes startling. And sometimes they come out growing out of the ground here in New Jersey looking very different from Rashi or somebody's Rabbi. And that's okay. It's not only okay, it's what God wants. We are a people whose women can and should be equal in all roles. And we love the state and the land and the people of Israel as the true historical center of Judaism in the world and moving forward. We see ourselves increasingly on the periphery of what history will see as Judaism of the 21st century. And that's good. We send our children to Israel to visit, and we are proud of those that make Aliyah. And we need to talk about that more. We believe in a synagogue that sets a religious standard that exceeds our own personal lives to inspire us and to maintain credibility of our traditions. We believe that we are one and in common with the other movements as Jews, even while we are uniquely suited to live and believe the Judaism of this movement. We believe in the importance of synagogue as the primary institution of Jewish history, and that our relationship with God is most expressed in prayer and study. These things are a unique mix which both defines the historical conservative movement and the Jews of the Pew study. The movement is alive in the population. It is smaller, and the current situation can be viewed as a crucible, reducing and refining what the movement is to become. If the current leaders can embrace that fact instead of chasing rainbows in the other movement's areas of strength, the conservative movement will and should be alive and well. Ken Yehi Ratzon.